Thanks for joining us this evening for our Beauty and Benefits of Landscaping with Native Plants webinar. This event is brought to you by King Conservation District, which is a non-regulatory special purpose district that focuses on natural resource conservation in King County. We have a special guest speaker this evening, a native plant expert, Jacobus Saperstein. He worked with KCD for 13 years, planning rural streamside restoration projects, and really comes at this from a restoration ecology background. We'll have lots of good resources and answers for your questions about how to best make your yard, beautiful and ecologically sound as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Jacobus now, and he can go ahead and start sharing his thoughts about native plants.
Thanks, Marin. Welcome, everybody. Again, I'm Jacobus Saperstein. Really happy to share my passion for native plants and some of my expertise in working with them, and not only just as a restoration ecologist, but also as a homeowner and using them around my own personal home as well. And I think you'll find in this talk that I'm pretty passionate about it, and hope some of that rubs off on you and you start your own process journeying down the native plant road as well. And maybe some of you, probably a lot of you already have, and that's great. So I want to acknowledge that this is a pretty basic entry-level talk, but I think for the more experienced people, you might find that I'll sprinkle in some deeper tips that you might want to take some notes down to. This talk will be about 50-ish slides, last a little bit more than an hour, and then we'll have a good, hopefully 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. We'll have a break in the middle too for some question and answers. The first half is really setting the stage with some kind of details about using native plants and how to pick the right plant for the right place. And then the last half is really highlighting some beautiful photos of the beautiful plants that we want to get you inspired to use. We've got about 25 different species selected out and categorized by kind of habitat or conditions that they prefer. And that will be an opportunity for you to kind of get inspired for what might work in your yard, take some notes of what you got excited about, and potentially look into buying those at your local nursery or even KCD's annual bare root plant sale, which is going on right now. And I'll highlight that a little bit in the presentation as well. So getting into it, big picture, why do we like to promote using native plants? Well, water quality, native plants, and even just for the sheer aesthetics beauty. For water quality, we know that our streams and our water bodies evolved in our Pacific Northwest, especially on the west side of the Cascades, with dense forested vegetation along the banks of our waterways. And especially in our urban and suburban built environments, we've lost a lot of that plant community right next to the banks. And we're seeing, some negative effects of water quality related to the lack of vegetation on the banks of our waterways. We know that vegetation on these riparian areas along the banks can help filter out and uptake excess nutrients coming from our urban, suburban environments and the terrestrial world. And then also just the shading effect of trees really helps keep our waters cool and cold even throughout the summer. And that's becoming more important as our globe is warming, and more important for our iconic species like the salmon, who really evolved in this ecosystem dependent on cold, clear, crisp water. So really encourage you, if you have the opportunity on your own property, to try to get more native vegetation. And then, so that was water quality. And then native plants, we know that our native wildlife of birds and animals have evolved with our native plants and relied on our native plants for millennia for food and shelter, and there's really nothing better for them than our native plants. But this presentation is not really about all the ecological niches that our wildlife, you know, play out and use with our native plants. But we know that's there, and I enjoy seeing the use of birds and other wildlife in the native ecosystems that we try to incorporate into all sorts of our environments. And of course, this last little slide on the right is actually my yard. I bought a home 2 years ago, and you can see actually on the right side of my stairs, this was my project this spring, where I ripped out, that was just lawn there that you can see over my neighbor, and started putting in native plants there. And that's going to have, you know, marginal effects of improvement for water quality, but some, because it's going to infiltrate that rainwater into the ground a lot better than grass will. And we know that if you get water into the earth and interacting with the soil rather than running off onto our pavement in our streets, we're doing a lot to protect our water quality in our residential environments. So grass removal is really important for that. And then also, I'm already seeing more bird activity visiting it throughout this summer on some of the little plants that are even just, you know, the first summer. So that's really been exciting, but more work to be done. Okay, so native plants. We're using that term today really to focus in on native plants of the Pacific Northwest lowlands. So just setting the tone that the plants that I'm talking about today will all work really well in that climate zone. Maybe not so much way up high in the Olympic Mountains and Cascade Mountains or the east side of the state, although some of these very species will, all of these species exist outside of the Puget Sound lowlands. Yeah. And this talk is not really about extensively going into talking about non-native plants, definitely not talking about like ornamental plants. And many ornamental plants are just fine for you to use that you find at your nursery and use in your landscape and yard, and can have a lot of ecological benefit for some, you know, wildlife and water quality too. But we really do encourage native plants, because we know that those are not going to cause some problems that some of these ornamentals have created in our ecosystems and become invasive. So here's just a slide of a few of the common bullies, as we call them. Blackberry on that upper left of the thorns, you know, probably run into those. We love their berries, but they become quite dense, forming monocultures, excluding a lot of other diversity of plants. Butterfly bush on the lower left, sometimes you can still actually find those at nurseries, as well as this big hedgerow here, cherry laurel, very common plant you can still find and buy in local nurseries. So just trying to educate you that you might want to do a little due diligence and learn what some of these backyard bullies of, you know, available non-native plants that can have some pretty negative ecological effects as they escape into the wild ecosystems of our parks and forests and stuff like that. Ivy is a classic one there on the far right, and how it carpets the forest floor, out competing stuff, and even climbing up trees and causing a lot of damage to trees as they grow vertical on them. What I do like to point out is you to try to look at your lens, because if you have these on your property and you're looking to kind of transition away from some of these non-native invasive plants, maybe you're kind of attached to them because they provide a certain form or function, like a hedgerow of evergreen cherry laurel. Well, maybe you can transition that to another native plant that can provide that same function and aesthetic value for you. So much like the butterfly bush, a lot of people love to buy the butterfly bush because it, you know, is going to attract butterflies. Well, a lot of other native plants are going to do that same thing and maybe even better. Another example of that kind of shifting your mind from the form and the function from an ivy ground cover. Maybe you like that in your yard because it provides that low evergreen cover. Then look for a native that might provide something similar to that. And Salal is another classic one that you might be able to entertain. It's going to grow taller than ivy, but it might fit in your spot. Here's another picture of Salal and its little flowers before the berries come out. Another thing that people like in their landscape yard are things that climb up and trellis. Ivy is one of those. That's the picture on the right, or clematis on the left. There's a few species of clematis that are non-native and invasive. There's other ornamentals that haven't really become invasives, different forms of clematis. So maybe do a little research on that. But the ivy, especially as it goes vertical, climbing up a trellis like that for you, or a tree. I really want to encourage you to try to remove that, because that's when the ivy does this and produces berries. And then the birds eat the berries and spread them into parks and green spaces like that. So oddly enough, it rarely produces berries if it just stays on the ground in a carpet form. So if you at least keep it from going vertical, you're doing us some favors from keeping it going to flower. And you'll notice that the leaf changes too. Notice how round and kind of spade shaped the leaf is once it goes vertical, versus on the ground, I'll go back, it's more of the kind of three-pointed leaf. So it's the same species, same plant, just morphing as it goes vertical. And what's a good native plant that you might be able to replace that's a climber? Well, my favorites are these two species of honeysuckle. There's the Lonicera chiloensis. You see on the top, that's what this photo is, the orange honeysuckle. And then there's hairy honeysuckle, no photo here. They don't do so well as bare root plants, so we don't sell them. One year I brought them in to sell and they just don't do very well that way, but look for them at your native plant nursery, or a nursery that has a native section. They're not very commonly found, but they're out there to find. And I would definitely try to, as I go through this talk, focus in, if you can, take notes on not just the common name, but really that scientific name is going to get you the true species that you're really going to want. And I'll highlight, there's a couple of times in the slideshow where there's a species that the common name is really, used widely amongst ornamentals as well. And I'll try to highlight that too. And those are the ones you really want to have the Latin name for, scientific Latin name. All right, that's orange honeysuckle. I think it's beautiful. The hummingbirds love it with the trumpet flowers. But now I'll just shift into a little bit of like plant. We're going to talk a lot more about specific native plants that I love. We'll get there. That was just a few of like form and function and how you can think about transitioning from maybe some ornamentals to natives. But now a little bit about different plant stock varieties. You heard me mention bare root plants. That's kind of an illustration here on the far left of bare roots, where you're actually buying plants with no soil around their roots. And there's a lot of special concerns and considerations around that we'll get into. The one in the middle there, container or potted material, there's some pros and cons to those as well. It will kind of highlight quickly. And then on the far right there, that's kind of a pretty poor artist rendition of stakes, live stakes, where we're going to talk about how to use stakes and why and when you might want to do that. So container plants, that's that potted plant that you're most familiar with when you go to a nursery. That's usually what they're selling, the different sizes of them. This here are photos of our little native nursery that were growing out little babies. We potted up some little baby bare roots there. and grow them out for a year and then take them out to restoration sites. And in 1 year of growing them in these pots, they'll triple, quadruple in size and be really ready and robust to go out on a project. But these are nice because you can go buy them. They're more readily available when you go to a nursery. You can buy them, take them home, let them sit in your yard for days, weeks, months, right, before you actually plant them. So they're really flexible that way. But they're also the most expensive plant material to buy. You go to a nursery to get a little 1 gallon plant like this, you're probably paying $8 to $16 a plant, depending on the species. So that's not going to make your project go very far. And there's some other alternatives that we'll discuss that are for some more affordable plant material. But really, everyone knows how to plant a containered plant. Well, not everybody, but most people are more familiar. When you start getting into things like stakes, that's a little more unique. It's hard to you can't really go to a nursery to buy stakes. Us in the restoration world, we can through wholesale suppliers, but for you, it's really thinking about maybe you already have some of these specific species that render themselves well to staking already on your property, or your neighbor's property, or your uncle's property, or your friend's property that owns a patch of woods, and it allows you to go harvest some of these plants. It's pretty easy and pretty magical to go out to a thicket of willow and cut a 3-foot section, is a classic length, of try to get a nice straight arm like this one, pretty straight. Trim off all the branches and leaves, so it's just one stake, and then plant that in the ground about halfway down into the ground, and it's going to send out new roots through the below ground and sprout out with top growth come spring. And a couple of species work really well for this here on the left side: willow, red osier dogwood, cottonwood, black twinberry. Of those, I'd say the willow works the best. Cottonwood really well too. Red osier dogwood next best, and then black twinberry, okay. So, but if you're able to harvest stuff, plant, and get it free, harvest a bunch. Don't hurt and harm the plant you're harvesting from. Think about 20% or less of harvesting of the healthy plant, and then use these on your own projects at home. Now, these are all pretty wet-loving species, and they've evolved to kind of be able to kind of break off a branch, get buried into the bank, and grow a whole new plant out of it. A lot of our more upland species, they don't really work too well to take a cutting and drive it into the ground and expect it to root out. So really stick with this, subset of species right here, which is not a big list of species, unfortunately. And then bare root plants, that's what we do a sale once a year, largely because retail nurseries don't sell bare root plants. They're not shelf stable. So it's a real challenge to make a business selling bare root plants. And that's where us as a government agency and other conservation districts throughout the state and other states host these annual bare root plant sales as a way to try to get really affordable native plant material into the hands of people that want to make their projects go farther. So, here's a classic photo of a pretty small bare root plant on the, in the middle there, a Doug fir. It's about 12 inches of top growth. And oftentimes they're coming with about equal 12 inches or so of root growth as well. Even if they're a little taller, they're usually going to have about 12 inches or more of root growth. So because they're bare root, they can be challenging to work with. And it takes we have a great fact sheet out there that you get with your order on how to take care of them. But here's a couple tips: is they want to get planted as soon as possible. They've already been out of the ground for a while and in cold storage by the time you get them. The roots want to stay moist all the way up until the time of planting. if they get dry for a short period of time, it's not, instant death. Just want to rehydrate them as soon as possible. So say you buy a bag of plants from us, roots are a little bit dry. We always recommend taking them home and soaking the roots for a good half a day or so in a barrel of water or a garbage can or something. And then same day, if you're not planting them right away, heel them into the ground, which is basically digging a hole to kind of just make one big lump planting of all those roots underground. That way you can even water them in a little bit if the soil is a little bit dry, but usually when you're getting these plants, it's, soils are pretty moist. And they can stay like that for quite a period of time, depending on the species. And I'm going to give you a couple of tips on which ones to plant first. But, with the roots, cold and underground and moist, they can, last there a week to a month, dependent on the species. The species that you want to plant first are going to be your evergreen species, because they don't really fully shut down quite as well as the deciduous species. So if it's got like this conifer here is evergreen, it's got green growth on it, you might want to start picking through. Maybe you got a couple hundred plants or 1,000 plants and you can't get them all in the ground. Get your conifers in the ground first. Also, any broadleaf evergreen. So that's some of those species like low Oregon grape or tall Oregon grape or rhododendron, things that have the broadleaf. So, kind of a big, thick leaf, round leaf, and is evergreen. It did not drop its leaves in the wintertime. So those guys can be really delicate for the same reasons. So get those in the ground first. Get them good and hydrated. Plant them that same day if you can, all the better. And then the rest of the deciduous ones, you can take your time on a little bit more. What you'll notice even is that some species start bud swelling a little sooner than others. And if you start seeing that, like on the Indian plum or the elderberry species that start swelling really soon, or the red flowering currant, plant those first. And some of the other ones that still don't have very big buds or any signs of leaves popping out, you can wait on those a little bit longer. But all of them will benefit from sooner than later. The picture on the right is a picture of a plug. So it's kind of an in-between a bare root and a potted plant because it doesn't have the container around it, but it does have the soil that the roots have grown into. So they're a lot more stable than a bare root plant, but still you'll want to keep them moist and get them in the ground, as soon as you can, but not necessarily before your bare root plants. If there's a lot more questions on bare root plants, happy to answer on care and planting technique or whatever later on. But the benefits too, right, are that cost. So we're selling plants less than $2 a plant, sometimes $1 a plant, and that's all making your project go a lot farther. But it does come with that downside of maybe slightly higher survivorship, especially if you're not taking great care of them. Okay, when do you plant these 3 different types of plants? Well, container plants all of them you want to plant in the wet, when the soils are wet and moist. Because no one really wants to plant in the summer. It's going to be stressful for the plant. They're breathing really hard. You're going to have to water it a ton to keep it from going into too much shock and dropping its leaves and stressing out. So really the best is now. November's great. Soils are moist. October was great too. December's great. These plants are pretty much shutting down. They're dormant for the most part. Soils are moist, and you can plant them and not need to worry about watering them until the summer. They're going to put root growth on all through this winter underground so that they're better able to kind of support their leaves when they bud out in the springtime. So typically say early October through the end of April. Obviously though, like I said, the fall is a little bit better than the spring. Stakes, I cut off stakes in end of February I don't really like to plant staking material after that, because there you're planting something that has 0 roots at all. So you want it to have its best fighting chance to put on some roots throughout the winter before it buds out and leaves out. If you plant that stake in March, it's got no roots. It's going to bud out on some of those, nice spring days and start putting on leaves, and it's going to dry its own stake out and probably can't support itself and die. So bare root plants, I would love to be able to plant them and sell them to you guys in the fall, but they're just not available then. Nurseries need to wait a little bit longer to get them to go fully dormant before they can extract them out of the ground. They're extracting one species at a time. And so we're trying to sell all these species all at once to you. So we have to wait till all the species are available. And that's really kind of around late January, February. We have our sale in March because actually January, February, when it gets snowy, they run into issues of being able to extract the plants out of the ground. Anyway, a lot of logistical issues with bare root plants and getting them out of the ground early enough. So we do our sale in like early to mid-March. And if you get them in the ground, sooner than later, you're doing yourself and the plant as much favor as possible. All right. Your bare root order is going to look something like this. Hopefully you've got a smile on your face like this guy, and you didn't wait in too long of a line, but be patient, because we get a lot of people coming through our doors in 2 days. It's pretty amazing the amount of orders that we're trying to process and get out the door. So don't come and expect a 5-minute in and out. Maybe give yourself a half hour to an hour to get your bag of plants. And this guy's got a bag of plants with probably 50 to 70 plants. And I like to put that in there as a frame of like what kind of car you need to bring for your order. We get a lot of questions like, can I come on a different day because I don't have access to a truck? Like, well, you're not going to need a truck. All these orders, unless you've ordered like many, many thousands of plants, are going to fit in the back of your Prius. They might be a little long and tall, and you lay a seat down or something. But yeah, that's what an order of, maybe up to 100 plants is going to look like. It's one kind of garbage bag's worth. We pack them with some moist cedar shavings in the bottom there, but they might have been sitting there for a good couple of days and really want to get out of that bag, hydrate those roots, and get them healed into the ground or planted. Okay, how do you pick the right plant for the right place? We'll just touch on this a little bit in our, Pacific lowland, Pacific Northwest kind of conditions that we have here. And a little bit about soil, a little bit of water, a little bit about sunlight. So soil, well, we kind of like to merge all 3 of those conditions to try to paint yourself a picture as to what you have on your property. It's great to draw some sketches of zones on your property. Here's kind of a basic little restoration plan around a pond. There are really great resources online, Google Earth, you can do this for free, get great images, and even draw little polygons and even measure the square footage of those polygons. And you can write and label, is it dry? Is it sunny? Is it wet? Things like that, like you see that I've done here. And it can help you kind of get it, especially with measuring those polygons, give you a good estimate on how many plants you might need in that area. And there's some online calculators that kind of can help you figure that out too. Like, I want my plants about 4 feet apart or 10 feet apart. And you can put that into a calculator, a little equation, and just Google, plant calculator, and you figure that out. So how do you get to that point? I want to say also, King County runs a great mapping program too. That's a lot of options of information for free. It's called iMap, and you can get lost in that and do a lot of research. And you can even get some really great aerial photos and make polygons and measure polygons just like that too. So through iMap. So for soils, I like to just mention that we're living, with a legacy of the last glacier that sat on our soils here in the Pacific Northwest Puget Sound lowlands. The Cordilleran ice sheet here was a mile thick of ice right over Seattle. And that, left a lot of compaction in our soils. Depending on where you are, that compaction layer actually can be very shallow. And then also what glaciers have done is as they recede, they leave glacial till, which is a very well draining soil strata of unconsolidated sands and gravels and rock. When it's up close, it can that's the glacial till at the toe of the glacier receding. That's all sediment that's been kind of like conveyor belted down from higher up on the glacier. As you can kind of see on that picture, these little strands of dark, and that's kind of these rivers of sediment being deposited at the toe. So up close, it might look kind of like that if you kind of saw it at a cross section of a berm of a pile or whatever. If you're digging in your yard and you're getting a lot of like golf ball, slightly rounded rock, golf ball, softball size, in between that kind of sandyish soils, that's this glacial till that we often call alderwood soils. But there's a lot of varieties of that too. And that on these glacial moraine, glacial tills, soils, that compaction layer can be at various depths and sometimes very shallow, even as shallow as like 12 to 18 inches down. And what that means is that even though you have well draining soils up top, you might have that compaction layer causing a lot of ponding in the wintertime. So you can have really wet soils in the winter because it's ponding a bit, and stagnant is not going through that if you're on really flat ground. But then once the summer hits and we don't get those rains and that top 18 inches dries out, any little rain we're getting just goes away. It's very droughty in the summer. So a lot of our plants can really struggle, and your planting efforts can struggle because you're going from really wet winters to really dry summers. So if you're in this kind of scenario, you will be needing to foster your plants through those first couple of years with some supplemental watering in the summertime. So something to think about. These soils find themselves typically in more of the hills of our Puget Sound lowlands. So if you think of yourself where you are topographically, if you're kind of up on some hills or midway up on hills, you're probably in something relatively similar to these alderwood gravelly soils, these glacial moraines. If you're down in more of a river valley bottom of a floodplain, like kind of, I don't have a good picture of it, but here's a good diagram of it. A river coming through, they flood, through years deposit totally different soil types. These are going to be much better at holding moisture and much more productive for farming on. This is where most of our productive farming happens. But also, if you're planting native plants in these areas, you're going to have a lot easier time getting them established and require less watering in the winter. Sunlight, this is kind of a basic one that a lot of people can kind of understand, but I encourage you to look up and think about north, south, east, west, and where your sun is coming from and how that's hitting your plants. Because if your aspect of, especially in our urban environment, you may not have full sun, for that 12 hours of the day. You might only have that sun really hitting your planted area for a portion of that day. So is that sun coming from the south? Is it coming from the north? Where's that aspect? And as we're in the north, plants that are south facing or southwest facing are going to be most kind of susceptible to drought stress versus things that are on the north aspect or east aspect. So you can see that play out on the east side quite well in the plant community, favoring the north side versus the south side. Here's a picture, of which way north is, and just that difference of the sun angle, can provide a habitat moist enough for trees to grow on that north facing side versus on the south. It doesn't have it dries out too much. So it's not happening quite that drastically visually here in the west side Cascades, but it is happening. So on your property. So I want you to just kind of pay attention to that. And then the east of the west side, it's less dramatic as the north-south, but our temperatures spike later in the afternoon, 2 to 5 o'clock in the afternoons, typically when we see in the summertime, the heat of the day. And that's when the sun is kind of further towards the west. So your plants that have that west aspect are going to be respiring a lot harder because the heat of the day is higher when the sun's hitting them versus if they're on the east side. The sun might be hitting them for the same amount of hours on the east side, but the temperature is a lot cooler, so they can kind of deal with that a little bit better. Well, moving into I've broken this into 3 categories: wet plants, dry plants, and then kind of generalist plants that are more flexible to kind of go either way. And we'll start with wet plants. So, if you're out there much of the year and you're, especially in the winter, your soils are looking like this, even into like April and May, you're in pretty wet, mucky soils, which could be a benefit if you plant the right species there, right? It's all about right plant, right place, because some plants love this kind of conditions. And some will, just tolerate it a lot more than others, right? So are more flexible. So the Western red cedar is kind of one of those. It doesn't require it to be super, super mucky like that, but it will tolerate it quite well. For each, I recognize that a lot of you don't have room or space in your urban environments for a big conifer tree like a cedar, but I always like to try to highlight one for each category, just in case you do, because these are really, really valuable assets to our, urban, especially our urban and suburban plant communities that we've lost a lot of. These guys do a ton of great work in intercepting our rainwater and trapping that water in a variety of ways, and either, evaporating off the leaves right away before it even hits the ground, or slowing the pulse of that rain event down through time and as it drips down to the ground, and then the plant taking it up in the wintertime, and then evapotranspiring back that water into the atmosphere. So they say that a mature conifer tree will, in a typical rain event in the Northwest, 70% of that water will never leave the system of that tree. That tree is doing 70% of all that water management. So we're having a lot of struggles with, our streams and flash flooding, and salmon are being harmed from that. So a large reason for that is we've lost this coniferous overstoring. So wherever we can get more of this back into our communities, the better. Okay, that's my plug for those guys. Cedar is great for those wet soils. Also, just a beautiful bark, very rot resistant. So, one that you might be more comfortable with, closer to your home or barn or structure, if you have one already on site, or, thinking about planting some closer to infrastructure. And, if you want a smaller tree, this is a nice deciduous one that really can tolerate its feet very wet, ponded, for large parts of the wintertime. Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia. And it has kind of a compound leaf, and not super pretty maybe I shouldn't say that, but until the fall. I don't have a good picture of it, but it does get this nice yellow leaf of fall color. And another real benefit of this one, or a real strong part of this guy, is if you're in that rural environment and you have deer and you have a lot of trouble in your yard with young plantings getting eaten by deer. The deer do not, or elk, want to eat the Oregon ash for some reason. It's like maybe it's toxic to them or something. Haven't really figured that out, but it's a real rock star for avoiding deer browse. And I should say the Oregon ash can tolerate very sunny as well. So and very flexible to drying out in the summer too. So it doesn't really need very wet soils in the summer. It can take it really wet in the winter and take it fairly dry in the summer. So really flexible that way. Cascara is one that's a little less flexible, but loves its feet wet and loves shade more than full sun, but it can tolerate full sun, especially after it's established. But I really love the leaf of this one, and these little black berries that show up real late summer as a good food source for native wildlife. You know, we talked about our native wildlife depending on the food source, and this is one that is a unique time frame. Not many things are bearing in the late summer, like September, like these guys are. So it's a really great late summer food source. And then beautiful fall color. I mean, look at that leaf there. So if you want a little splash of color in your yard or whatever, and these aren't huge trees. The Oregon ash probably bigger than the Cascara, and this one's probably topping out more like 20 feet tall, 25 after 15 years of growth or something like that. Down to the shrub layer, we've got red osier dogwood. This is one of those that we talked about could be staked. And I think it's a really beautiful one because of these, nice white flowers, these beautiful red twigs. I will warn you that sometimes the twigs are more green than red, depending on just the variety of the genetics. And also I think it varies depending on where you plant it. I tend to see more deeper reds come out like this when they're planted in a little more full sun environment versus a shady environment. They tend to stay a little greener stemmed. This one can tolerate it very shady and won't love it super sunny, but can tolerate its feet very wet. Willow's a great one if you really want the same things and full sun. So that's kind of the full sun alternative to the red osier dogwood. Twinberry was another one that can be staked, but not as high a survivorship on that. And this is also one that deer and elk just do not want to touch. So I don't have any more photos, sorry. But that's the little twinberry that comes out. It's got a nice little yellow flower on it too, obviously before the berry. So we've got red elderberry. There's two varieties of native elderberry, red and blue. We sell both in our plant sale. Red elderberry likes its feet wetter than the blue elderberry, and it also likes it shadier than the blue elderberry. So both are native to the west side Cascades, but blue is much more unique on the west side and more prolific on the east side. A lot of people think that the blue came over to the west side through trade of the berries with Native Americans crossing over from east to west. The berries are really of the blue have a lot of medicinal health benefits and value to them, more so than the red. The red has a little higher toxicity to it that is tricky to deal with. So the Native Americans preferred the blue elderberry. But yeah, pretty white flower. These guys, red berry, there you go. These guys can grow quite fast. Once they get established, after that first year or two, you'll see them kind of sleep a little bit. But then once because they're focusing on their roots, getting real sparse, deep roots, and then they can really charge fast because the wood growth that they're putting on is a hollowish, kind of pithy core. They're not investing as much hard wood in their stems, and they grow quite fast. anything else with red elderberry? Yeah. And then salmonberry, we all know, well, we don't all know, but if you don't know salmonberry, you should know it when you go on hikes in June and harvest their yummy, yummy berries. This is like our native blackberry, not as sweet as the blackberry, but beautiful berry, pretty little pink flower in May and early June. So it forms kind of more of like a thicket rather than kind of staying in place. So just something to, I'll warn you as we go through these plants, which ones like to kind of spread through their roots and form more of a thicket form. But I would say that the salmonberry does have thorns, but they don't really poke you and hurt you. They kind of flake off as you touch them. So not to be too scared of the thorn factor on the salmonberry. Pacific ninebarks, one of my more favorite wet loving plants, very hardy, easy to establish, can take it full sun to part shade. I wouldn't put it in like full shade. And I just love actually the bark on this one in the wintertime. I try to take a picture here where it's showing that contrast of the light underbark and the shaggy, flaky, dark outer bark. It's kind of like the madrone tree you'll see do that, but here in the shrub form. I think it's the twigs of this look really pretty in an ornamental garden in the middle of the winter. So, and then for the ground cover, here's one, deer fern. One of the few ground covers we still have left to sell at our bear. We're selling out on a lot of ground covers. So if you're really interested in ground cover, I suggest buying your plants tonight or tomorrow. But it's like a little baby sword fern. If you know what sword fern is like, these are much, much smaller. They love their feet wet and a lot of shade, full shade, no problem. And they have these beautiful little fiddleheads that curl out in the spring. So a really nice little delicate fern to incorporate and pretty easy to grow. And all these are on the easy, not too finicky kind of level. You're going to have some pretty good success rate with. So back to this real droughty soils. If you're kind of, midwinter, you're midsummer digging into your soils and it's bone dry in there and kind of sandy-ish, these plants will give you your best chance. So for conifers, that's going to be sticking more on like the shore pine side of things. Also Douglas fir can tolerate it quite dry and full sun. But if you're thinking more like shrubs, the classic one, everyone loves the red flowering currant. It's a great entry-level plant to give a lot of color in your yard. Very tolerant of abuse, in terms of droughty soils, full sun conditions. It can get fairly big, but not humongous for a shrub. So this one's probably a good 5 years old or so, and probably about 6 feet tall. And they don't get a lot bigger than that, but maybe maxing out on a really healthy mature one at 10 feet or so. They're not rhizomatous, so they're going to stay right where you plant it. And I got to tell you, I planted a bunch of these in my old house, and the hummingbirds, it was like a buffet bar. All early, they flower pretty early, like March through April, flower for a long time. As you can see, a lot of flowers on them. And the hummingbirds just will park it in your yard for months, feasting on these guys. It's really, really cool. So that's one of my favorites. A lot of people's favorites too. Your neighbors are going to be like, wow, what's that plant? That's great. And because it's an eye turner. Okay. Tall Oregon grape. I like to highlight this one. If you want a shrub that's evergreen and provides that kind of privacy screening in your yard, there's not a lot of native plants that are shrubs and evergreen. So this is one of them, but a lot of people don't like it because it's got pokey leaves. So think about that factor. I made the mistake of planting this in my old yard right next to my lawn where I like to be barefoot. And those pokey leaves, then they dry and they fall onto the lawn and you step on them. Oh, ouch, horrible. So not a good place to plant close to anywhere where you want to be barefoot. But they do, all the Oregon grapes, there's this tall and low, I'll highlight later, I believe. The grapes are edible, not super yummy right off the bat, but make them into a jam and use them, put a little sugar in that jam, and they're great. So they do have, I think, a pretty yellow flower in the spring, kind of at the top of the plant, kind of as almost like a little cone tuft. This is not showing it that way quite so well, but and those big bumblebees tend to really be attracted to these, not the honeybees, maybe the honeybees too, but I tend to see those big black and yellow honeybees frequenting these yellow flowers. And then ocean spray, Holodiscus Discolor. This is a great one, especially if you loves dry. We're still in the dry category, but if you really have some shade too, like even underneath a mature conifer, this might be one that could do the trick for you. Because a lot of people ask me, like, what can I plant underneath a conifer? It's really dry, it's really shady. And this one's one that might work for you. You might still need to give it some water, give it in those first couple of years. Anyway, but it doesn't need to be in the shade. It can tolerate full sun as well. It's got these beautiful white plumes. It's called ocean spray because it looks like, a curling ocean frothy wave. And that flower transitions to like a brown thistle feeder to all the small little birds, like the bush tits and the chickadees, the smallest little birds that you get to visit your yard, all through the late, mid to late summer. It's providing that little seed source for those little guys, which is really cool to see them kind of flock on this plant and eat those thistles. It's got these little Christmas tree leaves. And Nuka Rose. I like to highlight this one. You got to be careful about it. Right plant, right place. It loves the sun, but it's going to spread pretty aggressively sideways on you in a thicket and be pretty dense. So that could be to your benefit if you want that dense kind of thicket enclosing an area, but it might be a detriment if it's like something that's going to be encroaching on your walkway or your path and stuff like that. So it stays very low, which is unique. Topping out at a 6-foot height kind of thing is on the lower side, which can be nice if, say, you want to plant it on the top of a bluff and where you have a nice view, or a slope where you have a nice view over it. It does great for those. People ask a lot of times, I've got this slope, it's really dry. I love this plant because especially if that slope has erosion issues to it, these rhizomatous type species are going to be always able to kind of colonize those eroded out slopes. And they do a really great job just really sending the roots all over the place fairly shallowly and deeply, but shallowly so that they can kind of provide good soil stability. And this is one too, that these flowers, these rose flowers, are very open, and they're like these little helicopter landing pads for those bumblebees. You'll see these big black bumblebees clumsily flying along and landing on these beautiful helicopter landing pads. So, and then in the wintertime, you get these little rose hips that can be used to make variety medicinal and edible teas and stuff like that. There's a couple other native roses too that you can look at. Rosopisa carpa is another one that really loves its feet wet, but this is the one that can tolerate it really, really dry. Kinnikinnick, that's on the ground cover side of things, an evergreen that carpets really low to the ground. A great thing to incorporate as well, and provides these late summer, kind of early fall, beautiful little red berries. It looks kind of like little Christmas tree ornaments. So that's Kinnick. And then coastal strawberry is another good ground cover that does produce a strawberry, a very small strawberry, but that little small strawberry is going to be like 3 times as much strawberry flavor as a strawberry at the store. It's amazing. They're little candied strawberries. Yeah, so stays really low to the ground, and we'll send lots of runners pretty far. So keep that in mind if that's going to work for you or not. So that was talking about, the peregrine falcons, the specialists that kind of like it more wet or dry, and they like their niche, like a falcon likes to live on a cliff, and now we're going to talk about some of the generalists, like our crows or ravens, that kind of deal with a lot. For conifers, grand fir can kind of be flexible, shady, sunny. Not going to really want it super wet, not going to really want it super dry, kind of right in the middle. Beautiful cones kind of near the top that sit vertically. Going on to the deciduous kind of tree, big shrub. One of my favorite native plants of that category, probably my favorite native plant of a shrub tree would be the vine maple. Beautiful red colors, can tolerate it very shady. And I actually prefer it in a shady environment because it gets kind of real open and leggy and airy. This is kind of more in a full sun environment where it gets a little more bushy and full, but beautiful in both settings. So, but not really going to be your best if it's really dry and really sunny, right? So, mock orange. This is one, be very careful if you go to a nursery or you got them on the phone, you're asking for mock orange, because there's several other varieties of non-native things they call mock orange. So Philadelphus lewisii is going to be your keywords to use there. But I love this plant for the, lots of white flowers that it puts out blooming. It gets its name because the flower is kind of a citrusy scent that you can kind of pick up as you just casually walk by the plant. And it's not going to be rhizomously spreading, so stay right where it's at. And look, in full bloom, look how dense the white flowers get on you. Really beautiful. If you want, one little tip, put this right next to red flowering currants and alternate them, or work with the red and the white and how they can look really great together. Indian plum. I really love this one because it's flower comes out often like right before the leaf comes out in February. It's like the first thing to bud out in the forest. So it's like that, spring is finally here. Sigh of relief that I'm starting to see leaves come out, starting to see these beautiful little first splash of color in the forest is this white Indian plum flower, or osoberry is the main name, Homelaria cerasiformis. And it produces a little plum. So if you only plant one of these in your yard, though, you're not very likely to get plums because there's male and female varieties of this plant. So you want to have that one benefit why we sell a bundle of 10, because you're likely to get a female and a male, and they can cross-pollinate that way to produce your fruit. And the fruit is edible when they're in that purple stage. It's just a thin rind of fruit around mainly a pit, like one solid pit that you can kind of eat right off the vine, but not super yummy, but you can do a lot with it too. Cook with it. This is a plant that the berry is very yummy right off the vine, the thimbleberry. Get it when it's in that really dark red stage, and eat it right away because they're very soft and delicate. And if you try to bring them back home, you're just going to be making jam out of it, which is great, but they're going to kind of start disintegrating as you stack them into a bag. Pretty white flower, a nice no thorn to a berry plant, which is unusual. A soft fuzzy leaf, which is really great. And it does spread rhizominously, and it stays fairly low, like that Nuka Rose, kind of like 6 feet tall. So that can be a good option for you too, like the rose. But if you're as long as you're not in super droughty, super sunny conditions. And there's that close up of the flower. Snowberry, very flexible, low growing rhizomatous shrub. Also 5-6 feet of kind of max height on that one. But it's going to spread on you. Those berries are not edible unless you eat a little bit of them. They can be okay, but they don't taste very good. But you can use them medicinally as a laxative, actually. That's my timer. We're winding up soon. So, but the birds do eat them, but they really don't want to eat them until late when there's really not much else for them to eat. So even like right now, you'll see that these berries are still out on the plants, and which adds a nice little splash of white color in your yard. When all your leaves have dropped and there's no color in your yard, you can still have these little white Christmas tree ornament berries hanging on your shrubs. So, and you're providing a vital food source for some birds at a time when there's not much for them to eat. But not really a showy flowery kind of plant. Your rhododendron, it's got a showy flower, right? We have one native rhododendron. It's called the Pacific rhododendron, Rhododendron Mechaphyllum. And it's this pink color. And I think we all kind of know what rhododendrons are. It's basically grows similar to what you kind of think of a rhododendron. And this one's going to like more shade rather than things being more geared towards the full sun. It can tolerate like dense shade even, but kind of right in the middle there of not too wet, not too dry. But broadleaf and evergreen, which is kind of unique, right? But very slow growing. So don't expect this to provide, especially because we have to sell it as a plug. So it's going to be very small. All those plugs are very small. It's going to take a while before this provides, 5 years before it's even 4 feet tall. But that's it in its kind of native habitat. It's getting, 15 feet tall or so. And then low Oregon grape, like its big brother, the tall Oregon grape. This guy stays real low, more like 2 feet tall at the most, more like 1 foot-ish, and produces that kind of Oregon grape that you can cook with as well. Sword fern, I think this may be the last one. You probably all see this when we go on walks in our native forest, ubiquitous with the Pacific Northwest forests, and a great asset to incorporate into your yard. Very easy to grow, flexible, can transplant it well, and great on slopes as well if it's a shady slope, because this fern is one that can flex to be on the drier side, but it's not going to want to be dry and sunny. But if it's kind of dry and shady, it can tolerate that. Most all of our other shrubs are going to be wanting much more moist soils, or other ferns are going to want more moist soils. Thank you. Good luck. Best of luck to you guys with your projects.